The Memory of Love, Chapter 24. I slept in the chair, unable, in both senses, to lower myself to the floor. I slept for perhaps 2 hours, doubled over myself. Nobody knew where I was except Johnson. I could see what he was doing, leaving me to ruminate, to soften me up, the phrase they used in films. I tried to focus on the facts at hand. I had not been arrested or charged with anything. So far, I had cooperated. Johnson had trampled all over my goodwill. He was trying to drive me into a corner, provoke me into behaving as though I had something to hide. Well, there was nothing. So far, Johnson had accused me of precisely nothing. Then again, how exactly do you prove nothing? How do you fight nothing? The thoughts turned over and over in my mind. At one point, in the dead of the night, I had a sudden image of myself from the outside, a dark, untidy shape, hunched over itself on a chair in that small and empty room. My shape, my outline, in my mind's eye, was devoid of detail. It was not me, but the shadow of me, of what remained. It was as though I had already disappeared. I'm not one given to flights of fancy. Nevertheless, I could not control the thoughts that emerged indistinctly from superfluous places in my mind. Once I woke from dozing with a start, certain I had heard the sound of a cry. I listened. From somewhere in the building, I heard a thump, then nothing. Impossible to know whether I had imagined the sound, if it had come from outside or been part of my dreams. When dawn came, I was exhausted, relieved the night was over, even knowing that in all likelihood, the day ahead would be a difficult one. At least it held some hope, if only for the prospect of progress. Today was Saturday. Friday morning, when I had been brought here, normally I would be drinking coffee at home, reviewing the newspapers. Nobody was expecting me. I had no social engagements. At 10 o'clock, a guard came for me. I could smell the foulness of my own breath, felt the rough stubble on my chin, the flakes of dried sweat under my arms. My clothes were stained and crumpled. I'd eaten nothing since I was brought in the day before. The last drink I'd had was when I drank some water out of my cupped hand at the basin when I went to the lavatory. My escort did not look at me, but pushed me by the shoulder out of the door. We turned left, back towards the entrance of the building. For a brief moment, I dared to hope perhaps I was being released. I was wrong. We turned away from the entrance and went up 2 flights of stairs to another floor, another passage, another room. My guard opened the door and pushed me inside. I was in Johnson's office. He was seated at his desk. His first words to me were, "I am sorry, Mr. Cole. It was not my intention to delay you overnight. A matter of some urgency arose. Please accept my apologies." He did not offer me a seat. I remained where I was, standing before him. He repeated his apology, placing an emphasis on the first word, "please," and then in a softer voice, a technique which served to heighten the sense of threat and to increase the impression he was giving an order. "Accept my apologies." "Very well, if that was what was required. Please sit down." I sat. "Can I get you anything?" I was hoarse. I needed a drink of water. He called the guard and ordered him to bring a jug of water and a glass. Upon his desk lay an open pink folder containing a number of papers. While I drank, he leafed through them, all very theatrical. I remember his old man's hands, wizened and small, like those of an ancient Chinaman. He reminded me of my old headmaster, who was given to this sort of display, designed to demonstrate who was boss. "I've been reviewing your file." "What the hell? What file?" He ignored me. "You recently attempted to publish a political tract." "I've done nothing of the sort," I replied. "Is that so?" He looked at me directly. That's right, I said. About this, I was confident. I thought formed. No, I daren't allow myself to think it. There'd been a mix-up, a mistake, quite possibly Johnson's. I might yet get one over him, but it wouldn't do to goad him, provoking him into justifying himself. I kept my voice neutral as I continued. I think there's some confusion, a mix-up. Perhaps somebody has mixed me up with another person. I deliberately annoyed use of the second nominative pronoun. Not his mistake, someone's mistake. Men concerned with power and the display of it required some kind of face-saving device. Who? I don't know. One of your investigating officers, perhaps. I'm not asking you who made this error, as you claim. I'm asking who you are, saying I have confused you with. That threw me, I confess, the way he took it right back to himself. I don't know, I replied. You have somebody in mind, somebody else who has published a political tract, a colleague, perhaps? No, I don't. He had a confounding way about him, as unreadable and unpredictable as a cat. I said, I am just telling you, I have not attempted to publish any tract or manifesto or any political writing of any sort. I don't involve myself in politics. All this time he had kept his gaze firmly upon my face. To my annoyance, I found I was beginning to sweat, small prickles in my underarms, down the line of my spine. Now he looked down and read aloud from one of the sheets of paper in front of him, following the words with his forefinger. Reflections on Changing Political Dynamics. It was the title of the paper I had submitted to the faculty journal. Despite myself, I felt the muscle of my heart contract, a tiny pulse. That's the title of one of my papers, I said. I submitted it to our journal at the university. It was turned down. So you admit you are the author? Why did he insist on using this kind of language? In this paranoid world, there were no simple facts. Everything was an accusation, a confession. Yes, I considered, and added, it's an academic paper, not a manifesto. Read it and you will understand perfectly. He picked up the file, holding the edge between his thumb and forefinger. He gave it a shake to demonstrate its flimsiness. Your file doesn't appear to contain the text of the article. Perhaps you can explain it to me. Yes, of course. I drew a breath and began to outline the context of the paper, accurately aware of the sound of each sentence, each choice of word, how a mind like his, always on the search for the telling, the incriminating, would process each one. I concentrated on rehearsing the minute of certain and controversial constitutional changes and the creation of the instruments of state in the late 1950s. I steered clear of mentioning names. This is a small country. You never knew who was related to whom. You'd be surprised how even the lowliest person might have political connections, and one might very well ask how Johnson had acquired his present position. Though it had to be said, his natural aptitude for the work would seem to dispense with any need for nepotism. As I spoke, I revised, edited, and modified the truth of the piece. All the time, I was aware of Johnson's eye upon me. I kept my hands in my lap to control any trembling. I slowed my speech as much as I dared. I focused on bringing my breathing under control. I waited for Johnson to stop me, but he listened without interruption. I repeated myself once or twice over the effects of the Stevenson Constitution in shifting power to the protectorate. It did not matter. Much worse, the ridiculousness rhyme once taught to me by an erstwhile colleague from Scotland came to mind. Beresford stuff makes me puke. I had the curious sensation of feeling my mind split into two. One part controlled the movement of my lips like a ventriloquist dummy, outlining my paper for Johnson's benefit, while in the other, the absurdity repeated itself over and over. Beresford stuff makes me puke. But in the protectorate, the expectorate, I tried to think precisely, to engage the necessary half of my brain. I was able to hold myself together, sufficiently to briefly describe my conclusions and draw to a halt. Johnson continued to engage my gaze. "Well done, Mr. Cole," and he gave me one of his pared-down smiles. I had been unaware of the piles of sweat that had broken upon my brow. Now I felt a drop begin its descent down my temple. I had not spoken a single untruth, and yet somehow I had failed. I knew then Johnson would never be persuaded. He knew what he wanted. He wanted me. There was no getting out of this so easily. I felt angry and overwhelmingly weary. I was tired of games. I said, "Why don't you let me telephone my dean? He can explain." It was an imperfect strategy, not one I would have chosen freely. If news had not already reached him, then I had no desire to alert the dean to my arrest. Certainly it would count against me. I knew how his mind worked. It would be marked as a troublemaker. It could have consequences for my career. But then, did that matter so very much? I was no high flyer. The very paper that was causing me so much trouble had even been declined for publication. Detainees are not permitted to make telephone calls other than to their legal representatives. Was I now a detainee? Was he trying to intimidate me? I hesitated to pursue it, for fear of having it confirmed, made solid. Then there would be no going back. I said, "It must be possible." "I assure you, I know the rules, Mr. Cole." He went on to quote the Act and even the clause relating to communications with detainees. I said, "Those laws were passed during the state of emergency and by the previous regime. Reference to them was contained in my paper." "That may be." He flattened his palm on my file in front of him. "I'm afraid I don't understand your point." The guard returned and escorted me back to my room. My room, as I had already begun to think of it. I sat on the chair. Once, twice, I heard sounds of other people, steps in the corridor. I waited through the afternoon and evening. Again, I reviewed my conversation with Johnson. I pondered the existence of a file on me. At times, the fact of it seemed momentous, at other times insignificant. Quite likely, it contained nothing more than my employment and social security records, all of which he could have acquired without difficulty. The title of the paper. How had Johnson come to have knowledge of that? Who had supplied it? I checked myself. I was beginning to think like Johnson. The paper had been unremarkable, on all too unremarkable work of academia. Possibly, mention of it as contained in my employment records, and yet it was an unpublished paper. How could it have acquired such status? I thought, too, of Johnson, the practiced obtuseness, the implacability of his regard, and strange old man's hands, tiny, black, and wrinkled, those searching fingertips, monkey's hands, nitpicking hands. What was it he wanted? I didn't know. If I had, I might have given it to him. I wanted us more. The comforting task of lighting and inhaling. I was frightened. Nobody had hurt me so far, but one heard of things happening to people who were activists, troublemakers. And wasn't that precisely what Johnson seemed to insist on trying to pin on me? How quickly in such situations one searches out comfort where one will. A small rectangle of sun from the tiny window appeared on the wall. I moved the chair, took off my jacket and sat in it. I have always had a sharp sense of mortality. I had no wife, no children. I had no regrets. I was not being maudlin. I say simply that I had a sharp sense of my own mortality. I had never possessed the kind of fearlessness one finds so often in the very young, in my brother, before his illness, in Julius. Julius, what had he got me involved in? That moment during the night before, when I'd seen myself from the outside, not myself, the vacant space I occupied, I knew my limitations. I knew I was no hero. I must have fallen asleep. I awoke on the hard floor, grit pressed into my face. My body ached. The points of my hip and shoulder felt bruised. For a moment, I forgot where I was. Who hasn't had one of those terrible dreams in which some and remembered crime has come to light. Some dreadful act for which you know yourself to be responsible, because all the evidence is there in your own heart, and yet you can recall nothing of it. You wake up in your own bed, awash with relief. That dawn, when I woke, curled upon the floor of the cell, in the moment or two it took me to remember where I was. I waited in vain for the release that would tell me it had been a bad dream. I sat up. Somewhere out there, people were going about their business. My colleagues, my landlady, Safia. I barely thought about Safia. I wondered what she was doing, whether she had understood the reason for my absence. A guard came for me, just as one had the day before. I was shown into Johnson's office. He was standing with his back to me, studying the notice board behind his desk. I had tried to steel myself for another bout of his questions, but the truth is I was lost. When he turned to me and I saw it was not Johnson, but the dean, I almost collapsed with relief. I believe I would have cried were it not for the briskness of the dean's manner. He made no remark on my appearance, though his gaze lingered over me, no doubt because of his own particularity regarding matters of personal hygiene. He looked faintly repelled. He sat down in Johnson's chair. The table in front of him had been cleared of papers. My knees backward slightly and I sat down heavily in the chair opposite. I have spoken to Mr. Johnson. He has explained some of the matter to me. I've told him that you are one of the most reliable members of the faculty. As a result, he has been kind enough to allow the use of his office for us to have this conversation. Thank you. I see no reason why this should take very long at all. His manner was devoid of the fractious energy and absent-mindedness he displayed at other times. I was pleased. He was taking it seriously. At last, somebody to make sense of it all, to lead me out of this place. I have no idea what this is about, I said. I can assure you. Mr. Johnson tells me the police are clamping down on illegal publications, said the dean. It seems you may have been swept up in somebody else's business. He pushed a newspaper across the desk towards me, one of those street sheets with names like Scope and Searchlight. I thought of the vendor whose arrest I'd witnessed. The paper on the desk bore a date a month old. In terms of quality, it was marginally better produced than most. The dean continued, it's simply a matter of cooperating with these people. I didn't have the strength to argue with the dean, to tell him what kind of person Johnson was, how you could not believe anything he said. I waited. The dean pushed the paper an inch further towards me. He asked me to show you this. What does this have to do with me? Take a look. I opened the paper and began to turn the leaves one by one. I could feel the dean watching me. On the third page, on the right-hand side, a headline caused me to pause. I felt the same small electrical jolt to my heart as when Johnson had mentioned my essay. This article was entitled, A Black Man on the Moon. Read it. I had paused too long. I should have continued turning the pages, maintained a pretense. Too late. So I did as the dean had asked me and read the article. Put plainly, it consisted of a sustained attack upon the government on the regime's failure to observe basic human rights during their time in power. Progress in the country was in danger of stalling because the elite had more interest in lining their pockets. The relevance of the headline was to indicate to the reader how distant we were as a nation from such an achievement. There was no byline, and I noticed none of the other articles had bylines either. I scanned the article quickly. One phrase came to the fore that still sticks. At the present rate of development, it will take a century to achieve what many nations manage in a decade, an inversion of the words Julius had used. The very first evening we spent together, a century of work in a single decade. He'd been talking about the moon landing. The dean watched me, leaning back in Johnson's chair, balanced between the chair's two back legs and his toes. Before I had finished reading, he interrupted. Not the kind of thing we want associated with the university. I think you would agree. I noted. I was scarcely in a position to do otherwise. He let the chair drop forward and leaned his elbows on the desk. He was silent, tapping his pursed lips with his forefinger. Then he put his fingertips together and looked at me over their stapled up. Really, it's a matter of coming to some arrangement with these people. No more than that.